everyone, and welcome to the fourth episode of our Muscular Dystrophy UK podcast series, Our Muscles Matter. I'm Becca, and I'm your podcast host for today. I work at MD UK as the Stories Officer, and I live with SMA Type 2. I'm super excited to have two great guests with me today, Kerry Spink and Lauren Howarth, to chat about the topic of carers. Requiring care or having to provide care to a loved one with a muscle wasting condition is something most people in our community will deal with. Today we'll be talking about the impact this can have on our relationships, how to manage and maintain boundaries, and when might be the right time to consider starting the process of having paid carers. So let's get into it. I'm going to start by asking our guests to introduce themselves. Kerry, could you tell us a bit about yourself and your family?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Becca. So I'm mum to three teenagers, and my younger teens are actually identical twins, Oscar and Seb, and they are 14, nearly 15. They live with the early onset version of a type of dystrophy called FSHD. So I am parent carer to those two.
Thanks, Kerry. Great to have you on. And Lauren, are you alright to tell us about yourself as well?
Hi Becca, thanks for having me on. My name's Lauren and I first of all have a muscle wasting condition, same as Becca's, called spinal muscular atrophy type 2, and I also work for Muscular Dystrophy UK on their helpline. I answer calls and manage our inbox.
Great. So shall we start by talking about how our roles of being a carer or needing care affects our relationships with our loved ones? Kerry, let's start with you.
I think it does affect all your relationships when there's a diagnosis of a muscle wasting condition. And I find it quite a difficult balance as a parent. Obviously, I've got three children, and two of them have a muscle wasting condition. And sometimes it's quite hard to be mum rather than carer at certain points. And for the type of condition that my boys have, their FSHD is progressing. So they were quite physically able, and that's obviously reducing. So I'm needing to do more and more for them at a time as teenagers kind of hitting puberty when they want to get more and more independent. So that can be a real balance. So I think it really affects the kind of a mum-son relationship in quite a lot of ways. But also it affects all of our relationships kind of wider, especially with wider family. It can be quite challenging with two wheelchairs in the family. Public transport's a different matter entirely, isn't it? But trying to get anywhere with two wheelchairs can be a real challenge. In terms of trying to get to family, grandparents are a great example. Their houses aren't wheelchair accessible. But they are now old enough that they don't drive anymore to come to us. So it can really affect our relationships in terms of we have to make so much more of an effort in terms of the logistics and planning just to try and get together. And that can really kind of test your relationships and boundaries, I think. You get to know who the really important people are that stick around in your lives after that sort of diagnosis.
Yeah, definitely. And Lauren, what have your experiences been with having care and how this affects your relationships?
Yeah, so I have a mix of paid care and unpaid carers. I have a full team of paid staff that help me day to day. It's a 24/7 package, and that comes with its own trials and tribulations. Having, people in your house 24/7, it can be quite difficult. But I also receive a lot of care from my mum and my partner as well. And I can often find, I don't know if this is the same for you, Becca, but I can often feel quite burdened and like I am a burden to those who I'm asking for help from, especially my partner and my mum who are not paid to be that support for me. I can often feel like, I'm asking too much, or I might have asked for something, 15 minutes ago and they've just sat down and now I feel bad for asking for something else. So I think, trying to manage those feelings, it can be really tricky sometimes. And it has been, something that as I've, grown older and become an adult, it's something that has become easier for me to manage. I remember in my teen years, those were really hard feelings for me to deal with. But I feel like now as an adult, I've got more strategies and self-care in place to be able to manage it a bit better.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, guys. I can relate to quite a lot of what both of you have said. I've personally found it very challenging over the years to have loved ones, particularly my mum, needing to do some of my care. Like you say, Lauren, I've always felt quite a lot of guilt around this, and my mum is honestly like my best friend. But we've had to work very hard together to ensure we still have a good mother-daughter relationship, a bit like you're saying, Kerry, with your children. Because the care side of things really does put a strain on that. One thing that's really helped with separating this and increasing my independence is having paid carers. So, Lauren, what's your experience been with this and navigating having those people in your life with your partner, but also, having your partner do some of your care?
Yeah, I think there was definitely an element of, it takes a bit of time to get used to having a full set of carers. I started having care similar to what Oscar and Seb will be quite later on. I think I was 16, 15 or 16, when I had my first carer, and that was through social services. And I did find that it seemed like a massive jump to go from mum doing everything for me to having this new person who I'd never met before, helping me with all of these tasks. And it did take me quite a while to get used to like personal care and building up that trust to be able to allow somebody in to do those really vulnerable things for me. And that is something that's still with me today now, like as a 27-year-old. If I have a new carer now, it takes me a few months to really build that trust up, to allow them to help me with showering, toileting, things like that.
Definitely. And how do you sort of find um, navigating that, how much your partner does for you and how you kind of put those boundaries in place for the relationship?
Yeah, so I've always tried to keep a lot of my care separate from my relationship just to make sure that it wasn't putting any strain on him. Um, I will, if my carers are around, which they are 24/7 anyway, they are my first port of call. But obviously, if we're going on holiday, things like that, he is the person who assists me with that. And I did find it very difficult in the beginning to ask him for help, and it took me a little while to realize that he actually wants to help me. It's not that I've got a gun to his head. He is willing to help me. He's chosen to be with me, and that is, it's what comes with being with somebody in a wheelchair, and that's something that he's always made it very clear to me that, he might help with the physical side of things, but in our relationship, I'm doing the mental things, I'm managing the mental load of the relationship. So I think even though it looks like he's doing a lot, there is definitely a 50-50 balance anyway.
So true. Sounds a lot like me and my partner. And Kerry, so as a parent, how have you sort of found having done the amount of care that you do up until now? Have you been able to find any respite or anything? And what are your thoughts on sort of branching out to paid care?
It's so interesting listening to you and to Lauren in terms of where you are with what's potentially coming up for Oscar and Seb as well, because it feels like this age for I think anybody is a real transition period, isn't it, as a teenager? But this feels like a particularly big transition period for us now. I suppose there's a difference with a partner potentially giving that intimate kind of care because you are intimate in that way anyway. But as a mum trying to bath or shower my 15-year-old sons, like that is not what their peers would be expecting, and that feels quite awkward. But they're in that kind of place at the moment where it feels very odd to have your mum help you wash your hair like that in the bath, but at the same time it feels even weirder to have somebody who they don't know come into the house. And that obviously changes the dynamic for the whole of the family then, because then we now have to go through a whole new set of things to learn of employing carers, and having, effectively strangers that we will get to know come into our house and be around in our house and part of the family. To an extent, isn't it? So that feels like another big thing of an adjustment. I think dystrophy life as a parent carer is it's always about adjustments, and this feels like the next one. I think I'm very lucky, and our family's lucky in the sense that my boys are in a mainstream school. And they don't currently require a huge amount of overnight care, but we do have a lot of friends who do appreciate there are a lot of carers out there who do have to do that. So in terms of my respite, it does take its toll mentally, and I think recognizing when you're getting close to a bit of burnout, having to do EHCPs times two, the amount of forms and paperwork that goes with that, sometimes those can feel really overwhelming. So those are the times where I might need a little bit of a break, but at other times I think, well, actually I do have more space and I can still work whilst the boys are at school and things like that. And I appreciate there are others out there in the community that can't do that. But in terms of the kind of care, that's how it affects the kind of relationships and balance from a parent perspective for us.
Great, thanks, Kerry. And yeah, so obviously, it will be a big adjustment for the whole family, but how, in terms of your sons, how do they sort of feel about, like, are they sort of wanting to start looking at paid carers, or is it a bit of a not sure yet?
I think we're just starting to explore those conversations, and they've never been entirely looked after me in the sense of, like, they've had babysitters in the past when they were younger. They had a childminder for a little bit after school, and also they have very good teaching assistants in school who are heavily involved in their physiotherapy program. So I've really pushed for that over the past couple of years, especially just for them to get more used to have somebody else who's more hands-on physically with them. I think mentally the adjustment might be a little bit more in terms of teenagers accepting help anyway when they want to be independent. But having, been going to medical appointments for pretty much the whole of their lives, they're quite used to other people sort of, expecting them to take their clothes off to assess them for their physio session and things like that. So in some ways they're kind of working towards it, but I think it's more the mental block of kind of this idea of strangers who you don't know yet coming into your house to physically help you. So we're not quite there yet, but we know that it's coming. So they'll probably be a similar age to kind of Lauren was when she got her first. I think you said you were around 16, I think, Lauren. So that's where I see it being in kind of the next sort of 18 months process. And I have no idea at the moment how we even kind of start that process and start to find the right person. From what I've seen, it can be really hard to find the right people who not only have the availability, but also the right fit for you as a person. And I'm really conscious that with twins, it's really easy to have, assume they're kind of one unit, but they're not. There's such different personalities. The right carer for one might not be the right carer for another, and it's how we're going to adjust that and work with somebody who might need to get on with both of them and provide support for the two. So yeah, it's an interesting road to navigate. So I'll definitely be asking for advice, I think, as we go along.
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing, isn't it, about when is the right time to bring sort of carers in. I think I've had care since I was 5, so I grew up with it being much more normalized. I didn't, well, not being easy. Like you say, Kerry, it's very difficult to find the right person that clicks with you and things. But yeah, I know, Lauren, have you sort of had much experience on the helpline of people calling in about care support and things like that?
Yeah, we regularly get people calling who are caring for people. We get calls from people who are elderly, who are still caring for their children, and these children are like 30, 40, 50 years old, and they are still at the forefront. They are still fighting battles. They are still advocating for the children. And, I think a lot of the time they're actually not aware of what support is around that they can access, and it's just been the norm for them to carry on when they could have had more support if they'd have got in touch.
Yeah, I think it's definitely yeah, definitely a difficult one to navigate. Um, and yeah, I think we can all agree that needing care or being a carer definitely has its challenges. Do we want to talk a little bit more about these and ways that you've sort of found to look after your mental well-being? I know, Lauren, it can be quite challenging having carers around all the time, isn't it? So Have you sort of got any advice or tips for our listeners today?
Yeah, I think, it's something that I have struggled quite a lot with because I'm quite a private person and, having to have carers around 24/7, it can feel quite suffocating sometimes having somebody in your house 24/7, somebody's always around, someone can hear what you're doing all the time, see what you're doing all the time, even if they're in another room, you're aware that somebody else is around. So it definitely takes a lot of adjustment, but something that I have lent into quite heavily as an adult is, being quite creative and, picking up some more creative hobbies. That might be colouring, adult colouring, drawing, things like that. Just something that is, what I call a brain off activity where there's nothing going on in my brain. I'm just colouring away, and I that's something that I can do independently, which I can appreciate not everyone will be able to do, but just making time for something that you enjoy every day is definitely a big tip that I would suggest.
Completely agree. And Kerry, just in terms of support that you've sort of found, whether that's, physical support or more emotional support, how have you sort of found that along the way?
I think it's interesting listening to what you're saying there, Lauren, about having so many people around. And I totally get that with the 24/7 care. I think from us, we come at it. I almost am searching for people for mental respite, because for me, having the peer support of families like ours and finding other parents who are parenting children specifically with FSHD or other types of muscle wasting conditions has been a huge benefit to my mental health. And also finding that peer support group for the boys as well, actually, for them finding other children and people their own age who are in a similar situation so that it's kind of normalised. They're both power chair footballers. They both play for Manchester City, but they have an incredible group of lads that they play with, and a lot of them do have carers already, so it's quite normalised. We see those carers at training and when we're at matches, so that's also a really kind of good way of being around other people so that it just feels like a normal way of doing things. It's not unusual in the kind of circles that we're in. And we found a lot of that peer support through, funnily enough, contacting the helpline when we were first diagnosed, actually. Lauren, I don't think I spoke to you specifically when I rang and asked for some help, but we were put in touch with so many people in the community. And since then, I've joined WhatsApp groups. There's a mum's WhatsApp group that the charity do that I'm in. And I've also found other parents who are parenting children with FSHD, and that's made a massive difference for mental well-being. So yeah, I totally take it. Everybody's kind of well-being and health looks different, doesn't it? I love the idea of mindful colouring. That sounds gorgeous. I'm a big reader. I love to read a book. Or just take my dogs for a walk if I can get away from the house when the boys are being looked after elsewhere. That's great. I like getting out into nature as well, the greenery, so I could do all of those things for my well-being. But I think from a parent carer point of view, having those peer support relationships is probably what's made the biggest difference, not just to me but also to the boys as well, to the
Yeah,
lads.
yeah,
I don't know how
definitely.
your parents dealt with that, because you said you both had kind of parent carers as well. I don't know, did they find a similar type thing?
My mum reached out similarly to our helpline, to the Jennifer Trust helpline, which is now SMA UK. So yeah, she took a very similar path, because unfortunately after diagnosis there wasn't much support, and it is kind of left up to parents to, you know, find that support going forward, and the Jennifer Trust / SMA UK were absolutely fabulous at that time.
Yeah, I totally get that. The gap in support, we had absolutely nowhere to turn, and MD UK really came in and for that, because there isn't any other charity specific to FSHD that offers any sort of care and support. So we were so grateful that that's where we found people. And then obviously we've gone out and found accessible sport, which for us is just brilliant. The football, the WFA community is fantastic.
Yeah, I think for my mum, don't want to speak for her, but I think for my mum, a lot of the things that she found hardest, I would say, were I think there's a misconception around if you're having outside care come in, that that means that the parent isn't having to do anything. But that's completely far from the truth. Having agency care is a huge huge challenge. The amount of people that can call in sick or just be no shows or whatever. So, my mum, even though I did have outside care, would have to drop everything, to support me. Um, so yeah, that inconsistency I think was very hard, and as well as, in my lifetime, I've probably had over 130 carers, because of having them since I was 5 years old.
Wow.
And the emotional toll that that took on me was very hard, but the emotional toll that that took on my mum, who was my whole family, obviously, but my mum, was my primary caregiver, was really hard for her to watch. So I think for her, again, it was really important to find other parents who go through similar things. Like your son's Kerry, I went to a mainstream school, and I've never really had many sort of local friends or anything that we regularly saw who had disabilities. So it was all through online support groups and things like that, which I think is why it's so helpful now to have those things available.
Really interesting thing about your mum there, and I know you don't want to speak for her, but I just
No,
thought
of
that
course.
it was something you just said then about her kind of dropping everything. I just
Mhm.
related so hard to that.
Mm,
So I ended up changing careers because I used to be in a career where I had to do on call, go out and deal with the media, potentially at all hours of the night, and that's just not feasible. And it's had such an impact on us as a family because I've gone down to working part time, and I need to be based at home so that I am near to school. So yes, it's brilliant that they're in mainstream, but if they have a problem with the wheelchair battery breaking
yeah,
down on the way home from school, which they do frequently, I'll be the one that has to sort of drop everything and rush out and pick them up. So things like that. So I just really resonated with me then when you said that. I think a lot of parent carers are doing that, like you say, even if you have got the additional support in place. And I know most parents will do that for their children no matter what, but it's just those added layers of complexity with it when it's children with additional physical needs, because there's nobody else who can usually do it. It's not like I can ring a friend and go, can you just go and grab Oscar because his wheelchair is broken down, because they've got no physical way of getting his wheelchair in the car. So
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, completely. I think it's a really interesting, yeah, concept because, even at 26 now, my mum, she's not scheduled in to do any of my care, but, on Tuesday, just go on my care called in sick with half an hour's notice, and I had nobody else to come in and support me. So my mum had to change to working from home that day, and come in and support me. And, that guilt can be very hard for people with the condition, but also, for the parent. I imagine there's a lot of anxiety that comes with that. Lauren, I don't know about your situation.
Yeah, I think, it's echoing both of your situations. I think we're all in the same boat, aren't we? And I think it's going to be something that the community can relate to. I think there's aspects of everything that we've talked about that everybody's gonna, relate to and feel, that they understand and they've been through it themselves. I think it's something that's across the board, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And in terms of, having paid care and things, you know, it can be challenging, can't it? But, you know, in terms of the independence it gives and stuff, Lauren, I know you live with your partner, don't you? So do you want to just talk a little bit about, how you found that journey?
Yeah, I think having a full team of staff is really when my life started to kind of take off. It did give me that space to finally be an adult, and start making my own decisions and, be able to live independently. I think it really opened the doors for me. Like now, it's given me the opportunity to work. It's given me the opportunity to live independently, have pets, things like that. I think a without a full team of staff, that would not have been possible.
Yeah, and Kerry, I suppose, do you sort of have any advice for parents who, maybe are like currently doing a lot of care or looking at transitioning or
It's other than bigging up all the parent carers out there, I was about to say big up to all the mums out there because but there are some brilliant dads out there who are full-time carers as well, I know, but I just seem to know far more mums, and I know there are a lot of mums out there doing it, so always big up for the mums. But do you know what, it's really heartening listening to both of you talk about the value in having your team of carers, especially what you were just saying then, Lauren, about the independence it's given you. And I think, in some ways it's easy for me because I have got an older daughter as well. This is a weird transition time for parents anyway, at kind of 15, 16, because you're kind of letting go of those children that you've nurtured as they become young adults and kind of want to make their way in the big wide world. And it's really reassuring to know that that is still very much achievable for my lads, and that moving towards getting carers, which might not be a full team, all the time to start with, we potentially get there, but to give them more of that independence definitely sounds like we're moving the right way. So I think, for advice for other carers who are with children like mine, where you kind of juggling that, or maybe they're your first children and it feels strange, I'd say that still happened with my daughter who doesn't need carers, that kind of that free, giving them a sense of freedom and then wanting to go out and do their own thing. It's much scarier when they get to 18 and they can drive and go out on nights out and do things like that. You always worry about them, but it's really lovely to know that there's still a way forward and it's definitely achievable. It doesn't, having a muscle wasting condition doesn't have to stop you doing anything that you want to be able to go and do. And so it's heartening and reassuring to think that I think we're on the right sort of path, but it's definitely going to be a big learning curve for us now. I'll definitely be coming and asking lots of advice, I think, about employing carers and how to find them. It looks to me like, and I could be wrong, you might be able to tell me this, but like there's a real shortage out there, and trying to get respite care for people who are caring 24/7 seems to be a particular issue for some of the families we know, because that is really intense, isn't it? And I'm not sure whether there's enough out there, but you would know better than I.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a challenge, isn't it, Lauren? There's just not, it's not seen as enough of a career. I think in society there needs to be a big shift in how people see carers, because they are a huge backbone, in, supporting people have amazing lives. Lauren?
Yeah, and I think just off the back of what Kerry said about the respite and needing to make sure that there isn't burnout going on, checking in with each other and, ensuring that everyone is on the same page and that everyone's feeling good and happy to continue with what has been arranged, and, what the other person is feeling when it comes to the care. I think having those open conversations and check-ins are really important as well.
Definitely. Thanks, guys. So unfortunately, that brings us to the end of today's episode. Thanks so much, Lauren and Kerry, for coming on our podcast and sharing your stories. I'm sure our listeners have found it really helpful. At Muscular Dystrophy UK, we understand that needing care or being a carer can be challenging. If you need support, whether that's emotional or practical advice on external help that's available, please contact our helpline team. If you'd like to send in any suggestions for future discussions on our Muscles Matter podcast, or have any questions following today's discussion for us or our guests, please contact us on podcast@musculardystrophyuk.org. Have a great day, everyone, and we look forward to the next time.